In this video, I'm going to review one of the rarest and most elusive M42 mount lenses ever made, the Takumar 100mm f2. So how rare is this lens? Well, there was a time when some people doubted whether the lens ever went into any sort of production at all, other than a few test samples made in the mid-1960s. The definitive guide on Takumar lenses speculates that approximately several hundred of the lenses were made, while other sources put the number as low as 200. What gives this lens an even greater rarity status is the lack of reviews. I can't find any formal reviews online, and only a small number of photos. The best ones are these photos posted on the Pentax Forums website nearly 10 years ago by Pinhole Cam. And what beautiful photos they are, perhaps with a hint of swirl. So all in all, a very rare lens, one that people interested in this type of camera gear can only pray that one day it'll turn up unexpectedly in their hands. And that's precisely what happened to me. I was contacted out of the blue by Solomon, who owns one of these lenses. He primarily uses the lens on film cameras. You can see Solomon's photos with the Takumar f2 and his photos with other lenses on Instagram and on Flickr, and I'll put links to these accounts in the description below. Having watched my YouTube channel, Solomon wrote to me and asked whether I'd like to try the lens on my digital cameras and then post a review. Oh yes. As you might imagine, I'm extremely grateful for this kind offer, and I got to use the lens on two different digital cameras, a Pentax K1 and a Sony A7 Mark IV. I'm going to present my review in three parts. In the first part, I'll show you the lens, go through its specifications, and describe what it's like to use. In part 2, I'll demonstrate how the lens performs from stop down to wide open in different situations and compositions. Then in part 3, I'll quickly go through possible reasons why the lens didn't go into mass production, before discussing what might have happened if the lens had gone into production. In other words, based on how the lens performs, what sort of reputation do I think it would have now? How would it rank in the pantheon of great classic film-era lenses? Just a quick word about the names I'll be using during the video. Takumar lenses and Pentax cameras were made by the II Optical company, who I'll refer to as AOC for convenience from now on. I'll be calling the 100mm f2 simply the f2. AOC did produce other 100mm lenses, including the f3.5 from the late 1950s, and later the f4 bellows and f4 macro lenses. Starting with the specs, the lens weighs 351 grams and apparently has 5 elements arranged into 5 groups. I haven't taken it apart to check that. It has a preset aperture mechanism that goes from f2 to f22, a minimum focus distance of 1 meter, and a 58mm filter size. There are 8 aperture blades, but here's the first surprise to me, because when you look at the blades, you'll instantly see they're arranged in the shape of a kind of star, or what is sometimes described as sawtooth. As you can imagine, these blades are going to have a big impact on certain types of images. On coatings, I don't have any information about the coatings used on the glass. All we know is that the lens was made before AOC introduced super multi-coatings, but the lens could have simpler coatings. Instead of speculating, when I get onto the lens's performance, I'll look at how resistant the lens is to flare and light leaks in practice. The lens was made around the time that AOC started to introduce thorium into their glass, so I've tested the lens for radioactivity. Just before testing the lens, I should point out that the most radioactive parts of all the other lenses I've tested are in the rear elements. So for example, this is what happens when the Geiger-Müller counter is put up against the rear element of an SMC Takumar 50 f1.4. I'll speed up the clip here to get to the maximum readings. Let's try the f2's rear element. By the way, this room's normal readings are between 17 and 20 CPM. I'll speed up the clip again and turn off the clicks as they can get irritating. And yes, the lens does have radioactive glass, but nothing like the f1.4. Now I'll turn the lens over and try the front. The readings are considerably higher for the front element. This could be caused in part by the lens's recessed rear element, as the counter readings do drop off, even when you get just a little distance away from the source of radioactivity. However, when I hold the counter a similar distance away from the front element, the readings are still higher than the rear. This is interesting, because AOC definitely changed to putting more radioactive materials in the rear elements for other later Takumars. If you hold the lens up against a white background, you can see some tinting to the glass, Not as dramatic as some radioactive lenses, but it is there, and I'll test the impact of this on images later in the review. I've shown you the specs, but what is it like to hold and use this rare lens? It's beautifully engineered, very solidly made, and a convenient size, not too big or heavy, so it's nicely balanced on film and digital cameras. Physically, it's a little longer than, say, a contemporary 85mm lens, but not much heavier, 351 grams versus 346 grams for this Takumar 85 f1.9. It's shorter than most M42 135mm lenses, although in the mid-1960s, AOC was selling this rather cute little preset f3.5 lens. I like the preset mechanism. It gives you good flexibility for playing with clickless aperture settings, while also being able to limit how far you stop down. The focus throw is satisfyingly smooth, but it has quite a big turn from infinity to the minimum focusing distance. The MFD at 1 meter is not great for close-ups, but it's okay. It's close enough to allow you to get some very nice shallow depth of field shots at f2, and also see some nice big juicy bokeh balls in the right background light conditions. I always use the lens with a hood, not just to help with contrast, but also to protect that extremely valuable front element. So let me give you my first impressions of what it's like using the lens in practice. It gives you a lovely, bright, crisp, short telephoto look through the viewfinder. You really feel like you're about to take a load of great photos without any trouble at all. Unfortunately, after my first outing with the lens, my results were not that great. Quite frankly, I was a little nervous about using such a rare lens, and this didn't help. And it has the kind of learning curve I think most of us experience with fast old lenses. Issues with nailing the focus wide open with narrow depths of field, keeping moving objects in focus, and avoiding camera shake stopped down when handheld, even with in-camera image stabilization. I quickly learned, similar to some other old lenses, that I couldn't rely on my camera's automatic metering and exposure settings. The results were too quirky, sometimes overexposing and sometimes under, and not on a consistent, predictable basis. I switched to manually adjusting the exposure, checking the results on the screen immediately after taking a photo. Even so, even with trial and error, it was a struggle in some situations to get the right balance between light and dark contrasts, something I'll return to later. The reality is that this is one of those lenses that requires a lot of care and attention when you're taking photos. The good news is that it really does reward hard work. And I should add that the work continues once you've taken photos and post-processed the results. I have applied some subtle post-processing to many of the images in the video, but where it's important to see straight out of camera images, that's what I'll present. And if I've applied a lot of post-processing, I'll note this on the image in question. I'm going to begin the review of the lens's optical performance by looking at the impact of those unusually shaped blades. I'll stick to describing the effects produced by the blades in this part, and not pass judgment on whether I personally find the effects attractive or not. And I won't speculate on why the lens designers might have decided to use these kind of blade shapes. I'll give you my opinion on all that in part 3. Interestingly, this isn't the only Takumar lens with saw-tooth blades. The macro Takumar 50mm f4, for example, has them, and indeed this early preset version, made from 1964, is physically rather similar to the f2, with its 8 blades, preset mechanism, and the same design for the focus ring. Here's a photo taken by the f2 stopped down to f22. You can see there's a small light positioned to the right in front of the chandelier. The small light is close to the front of the lens. Now I'll go to f2, and the out of focus highlight is off-center, so it's not going to be round. I'll get onto these off-center shapes when I talk about the lens's wide-open bokeh characteristics. I'll start to stop down the lens one notch at a time. The clicked aperture dial has named aperture settings, and then dots for stops in between, which I'll call f2 and then f2+, for instance. As you'll notice, the sawtooth blades show up immediately you start stopping down, and even as early as f2.8, the impact is quite striking. The shapes kind of transform from a sawtooth to a star around f5.6. And it's not until after f11 that the out-of-focus highlights start to look round. Now you won't always be taking photos where there are such obvious out-of-focus highlights in the composition. For the purposes of this review, I have gone out of my way to take photos with highlights at different stops to show you what they look like, but I'll also be including many photos where there aren't any obvious shapes defined by the blades. Concentrating on shots with highlights, here are a few compositions taken wide open and then stopped down somewhat for comparison. And a couple from stopped down to wide open. One thing those blades do extremely well when the lens is stopped right down to f/22 is to produce well-defined starbursts. And something else to notice from this image is how sharp the lens is even at f/22. Zooming in on my screen, I can read quite a few names on this roll of honour board, even though f/22 is not the lens's optimal f-stop for sharpness, and the board is not at the centre of the frame. So how sharp is the lens, from different stops all the way from wide open to stop down? I've taken photos of this Kodak Bantam through all the stops, and I'll run through the aperture changes as I speak. The lens is focused at its minimum focusing distance of 1 meter. I put some small lights in the background. They're there for reference only. If you're taking a product shot, for example, or you don't want background distractions, clearly you don't need to have them there at all. By the way, none of these shots have been sharpened in post-production. Having looked closely at the shots, it seems the optimal aperture setting for sharpness is around f8, similar to other lenses of this period. Here's the f8 image again, zooming into the details. The result, indoors, is pretty impressive. Have a look at that little hair on the top of the camera's mechanism. Unfortunately for my cleaning, it's quite sharply in view. Moving to f/22, the hair is no longer so sharply rendered, and neither are some of the other parts of the camera. As we saw earlier, f/22 is pretty good at longer distances, but I won't be using it for any more closer-up sharpness tests in this video. Wide open at f2, there's no chance of seeing that hair, but the in-focus parts of the camera, given the narrow depth of field, do look nice and sharp. There's obvious colour fringing on this image, and the lens does produce some chromatic aberrations. I've noticed colour fringing on other images as well, as you can see on this one, for instance. Some old lenses show hardly any fringing even in very bright light and high contrast situations, but this lens is not one of them. However, on balance, it's not such a major issue, not such a purple fringing monster, that it's worth dwelling on at any length. Now we've got a good benchmark at f8 for sharpness. Let's look at a different way of testing how the lens performs wide open at f2 compared to f8 sharpness, not only at the centre, but also towards the edges of the frame. To do this test, I took some photos of a bus stop timetable outside with my Sony a7 Mark IV on a tripod. The shots you're about to see are essentially straight out of camera. I took a number of shots and then selected the sharpest one. I did increase the lightness for a few images so they're comparable, but no touching the contrast boost, for example. With the Takumar at f8, you can see the characteristic bokeh highlight shapes in the background, and zooming into the sign, you can see the centre of the image is very sharp. And the sharpness of the edges is good too. At f2, the lens is centre sharp. Absolutely no complaints about this sharpness. However, the sharpness falls off somewhat towards the edges, where the details are not as well defined as they are at the centre. Out of curiosity, I also compared the lens with a few other lenses, just to give some sort of benchmark comparison. The first lens I tried was the Pentax f100 f2.8 macro. It was produced from 1987, around 22 years later than the f2, and it's one of the sharpest lenses Pentax ever made, certainly in the film era. Here's a crop from the centre of the bus stop sign, taken with both lenses wide open. The f100 is the clear winner. Actually, it's the clear winner both wide open and stop down, right across the frame. But still, the old f2 has done pretty well here, I reckon. A different comparison I tried for fun is with the Helios 40. Mine is one of the early silver versions, and it's a lens that also has a sawtooth aperture blade design. In the bus stop test, the Helios performs okay at f8, but wide open it gets soft almost immediately you move away from the centre. Here are the crops. You can see how quickly the Helios goes soft on this one. Going back to the chandelier shots, this is what the Helios image looks like at f2.8 compared to the Takumar, so you can see what the blades look like, and they look rather similar. Next, I'll move the Helios to wide open at f1.5. Have a look at how soft the chandelier is from the Helios. The image is not remotely as good overall as the Takumar wide open. There's a big noticeable difference. I'll be comparing the f2 sharpness with two other lenses in part 3, and my overall conclusion is that the lens is more than sharp enough at the centre, wide open, for narrow depth of field shots. And it looks impressively sharp stopped down to f8 and beyond. So it should be a fine walk-around and landscape lens, but we need to go much further out than the bus stop to confirm this. The first outdoor shot I'm going to show you, taken at f8, has no post-processing sharpening applied. It's not my favourite composition, but it's a useful image to look at. If we zoom into the lady sitting on the bench, well, this was a wow moment for me. I think this is a very impressive performance for a lens that is over half a century old. Then I tried this railway track view to see how well the lens performs stretching into infinity at f8. As I zoom around the image, I think the lens has performed better than many other old primes I've tested. This brings us on to contrasts and flares and the impact on colours. In bright daylight, the lens suffers from noticeable light leaks, even when the lens has a skylight filter and a hood. Here's a shot taken with the filter and the hood on, and you can see the light leaks towards the top of the image. And another example, on the left with an ordinary hood on the lens, and on the right my hand is over the hood to extend the coverage. It became obvious at this point that the lens needed a longer hood than the one I was using on the left. These photos were taken in bright but not direct sunlight, and they do suggest that the lens's glass isn't particularly well coated. The relative lack of coatings reduce the lens's contrasts and how vivid the colours are, especially in bright light at certain angles. In terms of flaring, in extremely bright light straight into the sun, you'll see the lens blows out completely, but so would many other lenses. Faced with less extreme but still very bright light, the lens flares in quite interesting ways. In this photo, I've applied a detailed extractor, increased saturation, boosted contrasts and colours, a lot of processing to focus on that robin. And here are a few other flares I managed to capture. I found the lens's sensitivity to bright light wasn't always solved by using a good deep hood, especially with light reflecting off bright objects within the lens's field of vision. This is also probably down to the lens's relative lack of coatings. Take a look at these images. The whites can be just too bright. So you have to be very careful with the camera settings to get acceptable images in these conditions, and sometimes also adjust the results in post-processing. In situations where the light and angle of light is more favourable for the lens, I've found the contrasts and colours are really lovely. Maybe the images lack that HD vibrancy of modern digital lenses, but they are attractive and eye-catching in their own right. Here's a rainbow road crossing, wide open and stopped down. Some flowers and plants from a flower market. An amazingly colourful glass bowl in the V&A Museum. Also at the V&A, some lovely reds. More reds from our local entertainment. Outside when the sun and the bees come out. And this more artistic attempt going through the aperture changes. On the related subject of colours and the lens's radioactive glass, the glass does seem to produce a warmer tint to images. Tint can seem relatively subtle until one compares exactly the same scene with another non-radioactive lens. And another example, this time compare with an iPhone image of the same scene. This tint can be rectified in post-processing, and some situations I rather like the warmness the lens produces. It's quite good for skin tones and portraits, for instance. But before talking about using the lens for portraits, we should cover how the lens performs as a walk-around and landscape lens, and then look at the bokeh it produces, how it renders out-of-focus blur. I'd like to show you a collection of shots that hopefully will give you an idea of how well the f2 performs as a walk-around and landscape lens. In a tunnel with the A7 Mark IV. These are from a journey into London with the K1. Another tunnel, this leads to the South Kensington Museums. In the Natural History Museum, again with the K1. In the Science Museum with the A7 Mark IV. This one is perhaps the ultimate walk-around story shot. And a few other shots to show how well the lens renders buildings and landscapes. Ending with this Egyptian goose and crop. Where the contrast and/or colours are a little washed out, you can always convert images into black and white. The f2 lens, like some other lenses of its era, can produce great monotone photographs. This one really didn't work in colour. The bright light had zapped the colours, and it looks much more dramatic in black and white. The colours weren't contrasty enough in this one. I was washed out. And this animated T-Rex was shot under blue lighting. And a few more examples where the image looked better in black and white. Now on to bokeh. There are two aspects to consider. Firstly, wide open bokeh, and secondly, foreground and background blur when the lens is stopped down. We've already talked about the impact of the blades stopped down on out of focus highlights, but blur is so much more than this. I'll kick off with wide open shots, where there are fewer bright highlights. And wide open in the right conditions, the lens produces lovely smooth bokeh. The subtle out of focus rendering is very beautiful. Where there are bright highlights or reflected lights in the composition, the lens produces very nice and large bokeh balls, round at the centre of the image and oval towards the edges. I'll show you a small sample of the many wide-open bokeh ball shots I've got from the lens, starting with this test shot taken at the lens's minimum focusing distance. With busier backgrounds, the advantage of using a fast 100mm lens like this one is that it smooths out busy backgrounds and foregrounds, with its narrow depth of field and out-of-focus rendering. And the lens is indeed capable of very smooth bokeh and into and out-of-focus transitions. I'll show you a few shots stopped down versus wide open. Where there are strong light and dark contrasts in the out-of-focus areas, the bokeh results from the lens are understandably rather busier. Have a look at these oranges. First of all, the image confirms how sharp the lens is wide open, zooming into the in-focus price tag on this orange. But looking at the rest of the image, the bokeh, reflecting the scene, is quite busy. And here are some other examples. You're getting a lot of bokeh in these images. Stopped down, with those saw-tooth blades, the bokeh in the right conditions can be, how can I describe it, quite zany. Here are some examples from the lens stopped down. If you want to maximize the saw-tooth shapes from the blades, you need to stop down to between f2.6 and f5.6. While we're looking at background blur, there are one or two photos online that suggest the lens might produce swirly bokeh, and one of the first snaps I took with the lens seems to confirm this, so let's look at the swirls. I set up a wall of lights to test for swirls and compare the results with a lens that definitely swirls like mad, the Helios 40. I'll start with the Helios. Zooming into one of the corners, you can see how the round shapes at the centre are distorted into a kind of squashed oval. It's actually a 3D effect because the light shapes are being distorted and twisted. I posted other videos on Helios swirls if you'd like to look at those. With the Helios lenses, the oval shapes away from the centre have flatter edges on one side. These flatter edges on the outside of the Helios 40 ovals help to boost the impression of swirly bokeh. The f2's highlights also show a swirly pattern, But the ovals in comparison are rounder, all the way round, and to my eyes, this means that its images won't actually look as swirly as the Helios. Here's another comparison indoors, and again you can see the flatter outside edge of the bokeh shapes from the Helios 40 compared to the Takumar, creating a slightly different look to the swirls. Then I went outside to the swirliest scene I can find in the winter, and here it is, photographed a few weeks earlier by another swirly lens, the Helios 77 M4. Curiously, this lens shows flatter edges to the ovals on the inside and not the outside. I took a video of the same scene with the f2. I think in this scene it works better to see it in a video rather than a photograph, and there are plenty of highlights to look at here. And one more image with swirls. So yes, the f2 does swirl, if you like that kind of effect, but to my eyes it's not as pronounced as the swirl from Helios lenses. And now last, but by no means least, portraits. Producing a very fine portrait lens, it's safe to assume, must have been one of the main objectives of the designers of this lens. It certainly has all the credentials to be a wonderful portrait lens, a very compatible focal length, sharp at the centre with beautiful bokeh wide open, and a fast speed to isolate your subject for 3D pop. And it produces lovely warm tones, although we can't credit that to the designers completely, as I believe the radioactive glass would have been clear and not tinted when it was first made. It's a fast lens, but it can't perform miracles and completely smooth over busy background details wide open, as we've seen, and stop down those blades won't be to everyone's taste. I've got an example here of busy bokeh. This is the portrait stop down, with quite a cluttered background, and what you want is for this background to be smoothed away. But the f2 doesn't do this. It's not as effective as a very fast 50, for instance. So if you're shooting against a busy background, or foreground in this case, you need to make sure it's interesting and sympathetic to the subject. I think I best describe this as a lens for more artistic style portraits with those interesting backgrounds. Alternatively, of course, if you don't want the out of focus areas or highlights to dominate the composition, make sure the composition is pretty uncluttered. To sum up, it's not the fastest lens, but it has a lot of creative possibilities, and this makes it an exceptional portrait lens, even of cats. In this third and final part of the review, I'm going to discuss why the lens was not mass-produced, and consider what sort of reputation it would have had today if it had been more readily available to buy. I'm covering these subjects not so much to speculate, but more to present my own conclusions about the lens and its performance. I think there are three potential reasons why the lens never went into mass production. I hope people watching this video will have their own reasons if I've missed something, or maybe there's someone out there who actually knows what happened. Firstly, it could have been that the lens was too time-consuming and expensive to produce. After making the early samples, AOC realized it was not going to be profitable, so they pulled the project. There's plenty of precedent for this. In the late 1950s and 1960s, AOC had a track record of testing and manufacturing different lens designs and dropping the ones they didn't believe were suitable. Take this lineup of cameras and lenses. The camera designs show quite a logical and incremental series of developments, from AOC's first M42 SLR in 1957, now called the AP, to the short-lived S, the more readily available K, and after some more innovations, the extremely popular Spotmatic. This one is an SP2 from 1971. The Takumar lens designs, on the other hand, went through more experimentation and upheaval. AOC tried and sold at least 4 different optical designs for their fast 50s. That's a big commitment to finding the right design. And then there was the famous 8-element 50 f1.4, a lens that some people say was too expensive to produce and was dropped in favour of a 7-element design, plus the fat version of the 35 f2, which was replaced by the thin version. Whether or not cost was the only reason for these decisions, it's clear that AOC were quite prepared to invest in designing different lenses, but they were also ruthless enough to drop lenses once made for commercial reasons. Secondly, after producing some copies of the lens, perhaps AOC and their valued clients felt that the lens had optical issues, that for some reason its performance wasn't sufficiently good to justify its market price. Well, now I've had a chance to try the lens, I think it performs very well, and it's a desirable top-of-the-range lens. However, there's one major proviso, and it's those saw-tooth blades. They're definitely an acquired taste. Personally, I don't really like them. The effects they produce are too bold and distracting in situations where there are strong highlights. I didn't find it easy to incorporate the effects into compositions in a sympathetic way. As we've seen, when you stop down the lens to f16 or f22, the highlights become dots and not so intrusive. But how often do you want to, or can you, shoot at those stops? I wonder why they designed the blades like this. Not just for the f2, but for the macro Takumar, for instance. Was it because they found it helped to enhance sharpness and rendering? Or were the designers, as I've seen suggested elsewhere, deliberately trying to avoid the kind of hexagonal and octagonal highlights produced by 6 and 8 straight-bladed lenses? If that was their objective, why didn't they add more blades? They knew how to make lenses with multiple blades. The preset Takumar 200 f3.5 has 18 blades, after all. Maybe it was too complicated and costly to assemble multiple blades in a smaller body. That didn't stop II Optical, also in the mid-1960s, from making this cute little 100 f2.8 Orister with 15 blades. But then even they reduced this to 6 blades for the same model later on. Perhaps it cost too much to assemble as well. By the way, I tested the Orister against the Takumar, and on the sharpness tests it did well, and the lens produces nice Bokeh colours, but it just lacks the resolving power of the f2. So for optical issues, maybe photographers at the time were not so keen on the saw-tooth blades either when they first came out. We just don't know, and there's no point speculating further. The third set of reasons why the f2 might not have been produced in more numbers is that it didn't fit well in the overall lineup of Takumar lenses. Perhaps it didn't generate enough interest, even in the loyal Japanese domestic market, so AOC decided it wasn't worth marketing and selling the lens worldwide. You have to ask, what exactly was the lens designed to do? What was the gap in the market? Was it, for example, designed as a supercharged portrait lens? If it was, how is it superior to the excellent Super Takumar 85 f1.9 that first appeared around the same time in 1964? And while AOC dropped the earlier 100 f3.5 from its lens lineup, the company continued to develop its 105 f2.8 lenses, dating back to 1957, making it all the time up to 1975 and the end of the M42 mount versions. The f2 was a faster, higher-powered lens, a lens that could be used both outdoors and indoors, not just for portraits and landscapes and so on, but also, as people have pointed out, for indoor events and concerts. And this makes sense, as the f2 does help handle lower light situations indoors. Indeed, that's one of the reasons why I spent a fair amount of time trying out the lens in museums. But how much demand is there for a specialist indoor museum or event or concert lens? It is fast, but so is the 85 f1.9, which was almost certainly cheaper to buy. This brings me on to the f1.9, because I tested this lens against the f2 as well. There's also a Takumar 85 f1.8, but that came later, and the f1.9 was the main offering from AOC in the mid-1960s. Wide open, I found my copy of the f1.9 was maybe not quite as sharp at the centre as the f2, but the f1.9 was sharper towards the edges. And the bokeh can be lovely. The downside with the f1.9 to me is that it only has 6 blades, and the hexagons stop down are not very attractive, and they stick around even to f16. Nevertheless, if you are after a nice, fast portrait lens in the 1960s, a lens that you could also use indoors for other purposes as well, then the f1.9 is, perhaps, a more obvious choice. Returning to the Takumar lens lineup, some years after the f2 was dropped, the company introduced a super multi-coated 100mm f4 macro in 1972. This did seem to meet a real need in the market, a much slower speed obviously, but with the macro capability, plus a good all-round lens to use. These lenses started a long and successful line of great Pentax 100mm macros that continue to this day. This brings me on to the question about what kind of reputation the f2 would have today if it had been produced in larger numbers. Right now it has a mythical status, and its extreme rarity means it's very highly valued and very highly priced, even assuming you can find one. But if we strip away the mystique and rarity value, how would it rate today amongst photographers? It's a very fine, well-engineered lens to use. Its performance is generally excellent for a variety of purposes. It's sharp and colourful if you control the contrast, and it produces beautiful bokeh, sometimes a little swirly, which some people do like. Top-of-the-range Takumars are justifiably popular, so even in larger numbers I think we'd be talking about a highly sought-after and expensive lens. And then you've got those saw-tooth blades. They may actually be a selling point in the digital world. The blades are not exclusively unique, but they do offer something different to most lenses, and buying lenses for unusual bokeh is quite fashionable these days. In terms of its competition, are we in the territory of lenses such as the II Optical Trio Plan, 100 f2.8 for instance? The Trio Plan is also much sought after and an increasingly expensive lens, ostensibly for its soap bubble bokeh. However, aside from the soap bubbles, I feel that Takumar is in a different class, more in the company of the legendary Biotar 75 f1.5. So in conclusion, I think this lens should be very highly rated today. I think it's a stellar lens, and it's a shame that AOC decided, for whatever reason, to stop production almost before it started. Although for lucky owners of this lens, its rarity makes it even more valuable to collectors, and understandably so. That's it. That's the end of my review, and I hope I've been able to do justice to this unique lens. I've tried to include enough photos to show you how the lens performs in different situations and conditions. It wasn't easy to get out and about to take photos during the time I was able to borrow the lens, and I promised Solomon I wouldn't take it out in bad weather conditions. I know England has a reputation for rain, but the weather has been unusually damp. Many of the photos in the video were snapped during brief periods of sunshine between the showers. I'll post some of the photos on my Flickr account over the coming weeks, with a link in the description. I'd be very interested in any feedback or comments you might have, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll end with a huge thank you again to Solomon for lending me the lens. It was very kind of you to do this. And until the next time, all the best.